This is the Flowering of the Middle Ages, History 4330, Week 9. I want to tell you what we're going to do tonight. I'll start by telling you what the plan is here. I'm going to go over and review what we did last week very quickly, and then we're going to see a presentation by Patricia Bozeman, who is the Special Collections Librarian, on the manuscripts in our library. Some of you may have seen them already, but if you haven't, this will be a wonderful preview for you. Then I want to show you a summary of manuscript illumination from the beginning of the time when manuscripts were illuminated through the 12th century, and show you how they change. So that's what we're going to do the first half of the class. The second half of the class, I'm going to be lecturing on the rise of schools and universities and talk about education in the Middle Ages. So that's what we're going to do tonight. We're mostly live, except for Pat Bozeman's presentation. So those of you off campus, I see we have at least one student in the Woodlands who I can see. And hi. And we also have some students at West Houston who I'm sure are there, and North Houston and Fort Bend. So last week I kind of blew it because somebody asked a question and I wasn't on my toes to tell Tom DeGregory that it was an off-campus student. So tonight I'll listen for your questions. If you have questions, please interrupt me and ask them. That goes for you in the class too, and remember to use your mics if you're going to ask me a question. Okay, I wanted to start out with a review of what we talked about last week, and I wanted to sum up what Tom DeGregory and John Snyder said. Last week we had Tom DeGregory on the ecotechnic revolution, and then we had John Snyder on the flowering of medieval music. And Tom DeGregory really put us into a mode of reviewing the medieval economy in a world context. So that's something we actually haven't done before. It was very helpful, I think. And one of the things he said was that the superior metallurgy of Europe was the key factor, and why the Europeans surged ahead in technology, because the Europeans had a metallurgy far superior to the Romans and better than anywhere else in the world at that time. I had suggested that perhaps this metalworking had been developed by the Germanic tribes, because it is, in fact, one of the skills of the Germans, one of the real strengths of the Germans, that they were skilled in metalworking. The first Indo-Europeans were the first to work iron, in fact, and introduced it into the ancient world. And the Germanic tribes and the Scandinavian tribes were very good at working gold and silver and iron. Above all, Tom DeGregory said, the Europeans had an inquisitive mentality, a propensity to explore and invent and take the technologies that they had and push them to the limit, to push the envelope to the extremes and beyond. And interestingly, John Snyder actually said the same thing in his lecture, if any of you caught that, where he said the musicians pushed it beyond what it could do. And especially with that very last piece he did, Ma fin et mon commencement, where he did it forwards and backwards, and I thought that was extremely intellectual. So let's just review very quickly. One of the things that Tom DeGregory talked about was the heavy plow, which made a huge difference, allowed Europe to open up its forests and cultivate, and of course that spurred the economy, and the power of the water wheel. And one point he made was that with the overshot water wheel, you increase the amount of work that can be done something like fourfold, so that an overshot water wheel can do 4 times the amount, generate 4 times the amount of power as a water wheel that is just a normal one. This, I wanted to show you a Gallic bracelet. This is an example of the kind of metalworking that the Germanic tribes were able to do, and this is very early in the Germanic invasions into Europe. This is 5th century, some of the metalworking of the 5th century, so you can see how really sophisticated it was very early on. This is a chalice and an altar tray that was done in France, actually by the Franks, and we can also see this in the development of armor. For example, the Roman armor they had was either leather, a leather kind of armor. Greek armor was similar, or scale armor, where they it's like sewing sequins on, sort of large sequins onto it. And the chain link mail of the medieval period was far superior to the Roman armor. The plate mail, which we'll see later, only came in at the very end of the Middle Ages. In fact, it was outmoded before it began. The chain link mail was the mail that medieval people wore. This is an example of the kind of metalworking that they were able to do. This is the votive crown of Swintilla. The Romans didn't wear crowns. And so this is a medieval invention, and you can see how sophisticated the metalwork is. This is the sword of Charlemagne, and there you can see the intricacy of the metalwork, and it's set with jewels and precious stones all over it, with this very sophisticated working of Charlemagne's sword. And this is the diadem of Charlemagne, again covered with, it is made of gold and it's covered with jewels inset all over it, along with enamel decoration as well. And here we see some of this chain link mail that the Normans had. The Scandinavians had the same kind of mail, by the way, as the Normans and as the Germans, and this is the time that it comes into being, is in the time of the Viking invasions. This is a censer of the 11th century, and I put this in because we're going to see one like this at the Museum of Fine Arts. There's one very similar to this. That is very intricate metalworking. You can see the sophistication and the heights that they're able to take this skill to. And I put this picture in. These are little candlestick holders because, does this remind you of anything? Remind you of anything that you've seen? What? Oh, yes.
It was from the Menil.
Yes, the little candlestick, the little wyvern at the Menil, in the Menil collection, that was a candlestick holder, and a fantastic beastie as a candlestick holder. This is very interesting because it shows the actual mining operation, and you can see how very sophisticated it is. I tried to get these in the right order. Here we have the digging of the ore from the ground, and you see the miners digging the ore and taking it out in wheelbarrows and basins. And here we see them wheeling it out even in carts and with their pickaxes digging the ore. And here they're carrying it and taking it to where it's supposed to be processed. And here are the supervisors who are counting the money and keeping the accounts. A mine was a very sophisticated operation, and here they are with the ovens where they're processing the ore. And here is processing the ore again, and here they are apparently counting the proceeds of the mine. And this is some more processing of the ore. I tried to get these in the right order so that you could see the process here. This is a collar that was for a goldsmith, and that's where these scenes of mining were put in chased silver. Okay, and here is an oven in which they're casting a bell, and you can see the bell being cast down here. And here is the result of that casting. Here are some bells that are being rung in the church, and I haven't figured out what these sophisticated little devices are here to ring the bells, but it looks very complicated to me. And here is sort of the ultimate, that the armor was taken to, and you can see this ultimate development of armor. This is when armor was completely outmoded. Nobody, I mean, it wasn't useful for protection. It was purely decoration at this point. But they're able to do very sophisticated work, and you can see how decorative it is, and the amount of skill and diversity that they can bring to it by looking at the different kinds of helmets here that were eventually made. And this one I particularly liked is the helmet of Don Jaime el Conquistador, and it has a dragon with wings on top of it. So these are the limits to which they took it, beyond the limits. And this technological revolution was connected with economic developments and the rise of towns. And towns were very important. Towns made enormous changes in the medieval lifestyle and the medieval culture. First of all, the towns acted as a safety valve for growing population. Because remember that because they could grow more food, they had a healthier diet. They had more land in cultivation. They had a healthier diet because of the field system and the growing of legumes, which had more protein in them. And so they had a population explosion. And when that happened, what are you going to do with the people on the manor house? You have too many people, that more than the manor can support, and also have surpluses to sell. And so they gravitated to the markets that were built around the monasteries and the castles. And so we see the gradual rising of towns, because after the heavy plow is in place, in the towns, the workmen, the people became workmen. They were no longer peasants who worked the land, but they became the butchers and the bakers and the tradesmen and the weavers, and they became the people who supported the town, the bricklayers and the builders of the cathedrals. They organized themselves in guilds, and a guild is very much like a modern labor union. The Guild of Bakers, for example, got all together and they set the rules for the different levels of bakers, so that you would have an apprentice baker who would be learning how, by experience, by going with the journeyman. The journeyman was the person who worked in the normal day as a baker, and then you have the master craftsman. The master of the guild would be the expert, the man of experience, and who taught the others. And so that was the setup for learning within the guilds. You had guilds of tradesmen and workers, and you had guilds of merchants. And another thing that the towns did is to instill an air of democracy within the Middle Ages. There's already an element of democracy there, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but town air is free air. And so those discontents who wanted to flee the manors could go to the town, and if you could stay in a town a year and a day, you were free. You were technically free. You could no longer be returned to your town. In addition, there were alliances between the kings and the towns to counter the power of the rural nobles, and so that's one way in which the kings, who are building up their power in the nation-state, formed alliances with the towns in order to lower the amount of power that the nobles had, so the king could work with the towns and then counter the power of his nobles. And so that's why kings granted charters of liberties to the towns. And I believe I have one in your readings book. I have some charters of liberties there in the section on, what section do I have it in? The national state, I think. So you might take a look at that. So here is a walled town, and in the center is a church surrounded by houses in the outside wall. This is an early medieval town, very small, and this is a town, this is Paris, the grand view of Paris at the time when this is really 16th century, and you can see the various churches. Even then, Paris was relatively small, as you can see, but this is what a typical medieval town looks like. Here is the corporation of goldsmiths in Paris carrying the shrine of Saint Genevieve, which is a reliquary that they have made out of gold. So the goldsmiths are coming as a guild. A guild is a corporation, and here they are with their handiwork, this wonderful shrine on the top. And here is the ancient corporate seal of the goldsmiths of Paris. So they are a corporation like the church is. A corporation is a legal person, and a corporation has life eternal. It never dies, so it sort of has eternal life. And this is the actual seal that they had. Here is an example of the builders who would have been the Builders Guild as they're building a cathedral, and the stonemasons would have had a guild. All the different groups of workmen would have had a guild. And here is the house of the Butchers Guild in Hildesheim, Germany, so that each of them had their own headquarters. They even built a house that was the home of their guild. Here's the town hall in Brussels, and as the towns grew and became more important, Brussels is in Flanders, which is an especially growing area, and the town hall could be almost as high as the cathedral. And so you can see the status of the town as you look at the growth of these official buildings in the town. Here's an altar of gold presented to the ancient cathedral of Basel by the Emperor Henry II. So this would have been, this would actually have been 11th century. And you can see the skill of the goldsmiths in building this altar. This is a picture of their handiwork here. And here's another example. This is 12th century. This is an enameled shrine made in Limoges, a work of the 12th century. So you can see how very skilled these Germanic peoples are, and they keep up their skill, and they get better and better as the time goes on in the Middle Ages. And I put this in because it should remind you of something. Does it remind you of anything we've seen? No. You want to press your mic? You want to press your mic?
Looks like that statue in the Menil.
Exactly. Yes, a little metalwork statue exactly like the one in the Menil. So I put this in because it's a statuette that is very reminiscent of that. So this shows tremendous skill in metalworking as well. Okay, now in addition to the towns and the guilds, the long-distance trade networks were set up, and we have to mention the North Sea network, which consisted of Flanders and England, a link between Flanders and England in which English wool was the raw material for developing Flemish cloth manufacture. So in Flanders, the Flemish imported the raw goods from England, and they set up manufacturing centers to manufacture the cloth. Another area is the Hanseatic League in northern Germany and Scandinavia, linking the North Sea trade. And there was a separate Mediterranean network in southern Spain, Italy, and the Holy Land, which really began with the First Crusade in 1096 to 1100 and was solidified in the Fourth Crusade when the Fourth Crusaders conquered Constantinople and took over the Greek kingdom or the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem in 1204. And here we can see some of these networks. I wanted to point them out to you. Here is the wool trade that you can see in England, the raw materials of wool in the major ports here, Southampton, the Winchester Fair, the Stourbridge Fair. And they traded with Flanders where the textiles were manufactured. And notice that there are towns all over Flanders. Notice how packed with towns Flanders is. And the fairs of Champagne, this is another place. While France, in the main part of France, agriculture is what they focused on. And in Limoges, they did metalworking and enamel. But here is the major manufacturing area, and up to the north, if we can see here, is the Hanseatic League that trades this way with Scandinavia and the Baltic Sea with the trade routes there. Here is another map. Oh, I'm sorry. Here is the cloth hall at Ypres, which is, again, you can see how gigantic it is. This is the cloth hall where the wool merchants sold their wool and their textiles. And again, it's as big as a cathedral. And so this shows how important it is. Here is, excuse me, here are some merchants, some Flemish merchants with their goods trading in Flanders. And here is a weaver who is practicing his trade of weaving. And notice that he's got it mechanized. Can you see his feet on those pedals? He's got the loom mechanized. Later on, they hooked those looms up to water mills, and they manufactured them. And they did what is called a factory train, where they took the water mill and they linked it up to dozens of looms, and they were mass producing their goods. And that's why Flanders was the economic leader of Europe, because it was the first to really mechanize. This is the town of Lübeck, which is one of the towns of the Hanseatic League, trading with the North Sea. And here we can see on this map the town of Lübeck. You can see Lübeck is up here, and these are all the towns. Lübeck is here, and these are the towns of the Hanseatic Leagues, which are not only linked by trade routes to Scandinavia through here and the Baltic Sea over here with Russia, but they're also linked with roads to southern Europe and to Flanders over here. So the trading networks in Europe are growing. And this map will show us some more of those trading networks. If we can maybe focus more on Europe over here, you can see, I hope you can see these trade routes in the Mediterranean. You see the Mediterranean where all the trade routes are linking Europe, and especially through Italy and Spain. Those are the major areas that link to Egypt and the Holy Land over here. And then up here you can see the North Sea trade routes up here. And so Europe is just bursting with trade at this time, and commerce and prosperity. That's how they got the money to build all those gigantic buildings. Okay, here is a medieval map of the Mediterranean Sea. It's a little bit hard to recognize, but that's what it is. It really is a medieval map of the Mediterranean Sea. And here is the port of Marseille in southern France, which was thriving at this time. Here are some merchants with a ship in the Levant, engaging in the trade that's going on at this time. Europe, as we said, was pushing the envelope, and I mentioned a moment ago factory trains hooking water and windmills to multiple machines like looms to weave the cloth, the development of cranks, gears, and clocks, and finally clockwork machines. And so the clocks and movable type are the crowning inventions of the Middle Ages. The clocks and clockwork open up whole new areas to Europeans. They fall in love with them. They're really fascinated with clocks. And the invention of movable type allows Europe to invent the printing press, and again, pushing the envelope. Another example is polyphonic music. Okay, here is here are the ships that are pushing the envelope. Here is the square sail of the northern climes, and eventually it develops into the caravel that allows Europeans to conquer the world. And here is the crank, the invention of the crank, which seems like a very simple invention, but it took them a long time to invent it. And here is a crank being used on a musical instrument, the hurdy-gurdy, which we've already seen. And here is a wonderful crank used on a weapon. They're using this crank on a crossbow that allows it to be drawn very tight and to shoot with a lot of power. Here are the gears that allow them to build clockwork. And one thing Tom de Gregory talked about was the first gears are like this with the square teeth, which aren't very efficient and get knocked about. They get chipped real easily. It's when they get this ratchet wheel with these staggered gears that allows them to build the clockwork. And here is a clock, and you can see the gears operating in the clock. They actually use the clockwork to do all kinds of things, not just run the clock, but when the hour would be struck, little men would march out and ring a bell, or horses would march by pulling wagons, or they would use the clockwork to do all kinds of marvelous things in order to animate the display of the clock. Here is a portrait of Gutenberg, an engraving of the 16th century. And here is an example of the type he used. And remember that Tom de Gregory said it was his skill what did he say? Being able to cast the type, in the metalworking of casting the type was the big breakthrough. In order to make the movable type, he had the ability to work the metal so that it could make the letters for the movable type. And here's another Gutenberg manuscript. And here is yet another one. I picked this one because I like this little picture here. Gutenberg is actually copying manuscripts. Last time we also saw the growth of the entertainment industry and the rise of polyphonic music. And polyphonic is, of course, two or more lines of music at once. We also might note the invention of new instruments and the invention of new musical types. For example, the motet, which had many more than two parts, pushing the envelope in music. And here we see some familiar instruments that remind us of the lute and the rebec. And here we see ancient lyres, for example, the lyre of the north and an ancient lyre, and the development of more elaborate psalteries and a nabulum along the lines of the lyre, the primitive kinds of trumpets, and the more complicated double flute, and a 9th century syrinx, and the psalterion, which is another stringed instrument that's very elaborate. Here is a minstrel's harp of the 15th century and the 5-stringed lute of the 13th century. And some even more elaborate musical instruments, a psaltery. That wasn't a psaltery, that was like a hurdy-gurdy, and this is a psaltery. They are inventing new instruments. Remember, the organ dates from the Roman period, and by the 15th century, the organ has grown to be enormously elaborate, like the church organs today. So the growth of the entertainment industry included not only musical instruments and performance, but also the kind of drama that we've seen. Here are some dancers. These happen to be Morris dancers. And I just this week found another music manuscript. This is a 10th century manuscript, which must be one of the earliest manuscripts that survives. Notice that the music is written with notes above the words, and so you can sort of see how it was evolving. This is 10th to 11th century. It's very early. And then this is one of Gutenberg's colleagues who did a musical manuscript, and you can see how it's grown to this period. Here are the musical instruments shown as the Tree of Jesse, so that you can see all of the different musical instruments in this manuscript. Now that we've sort of looked at the innovation and invention of the medieval period in technology, economics, and music, now we're going to turn to the medieval book and the creation of the medieval book. And we're going to have a presentation by Patricia Bozeman, who is the Director of Special Collections in the M.D. Anderson Library, and she will talk about medieval manuscripts.
How many of you in here have been to special collections? Anyone in the room? Oh, everyone. Goodness. That's great. So maybe you've seen some of the things that we'll be talking about. What we're going to do is work our way through the production of a medieval manuscript book. We're going to talk about preparing the parchment. We'll prepare the codex. The codex is the Western form of a book that we know today. We'll also talk about preparing to write, what the instruments were, what the environment was for writing. We'll talk about the copying of a manuscript. Then we'll talk about the decorating and the illuminating of a manuscript, which followed the actual textual copying. And finally, we'll look at binding the codex and show you some examples of that. Again, if you have any questions, any comments along the way, please press down your mic and let me know. We're going to look at a brief overview of the production of the manuscript book. I will serve as your tour guide, but this is really your exploration tonight. From the breakup of the Roman Empire, it was the church in general and the monastery in particular that was responsible for the preservation and transmission of literary traditions. For the Christian community, it was through the church that education was provided. The rise of the universities from the Middle Ages, this was certainly going on, but we are going to look specifically at the church and the monastery as the producer of books for this segment. Our first illustration shows the manuscript-making centers of Europe. The only way a layman could obtain an education in the European Christian socio-political system was to study with one of the religious orders, whose brethren were in charge of preparing men for the priesthood. One aspect of that training was learning to read and write. The peasant class was left out of this educational process, and despite the few women who were reading recipe books for households, women were fairly much excluded from this process, especially if they weren't in the wealthy merchant or noble class. What is a manuscript book? Both parts of the word manuscript come from two Latin words, manus, meaning hand, and scriptus, meaning writing. So, manuscripts are handwritten books. The book of the European Middle Ages was the parchment codex, a book composed of leaves of writing material fastened together to open like a modern book, as opposed to a scroll, which, by the way, is also a book. The medieval period represented the golden age of the book in the West, a period which many believe has never been surpassed in the beauty of its book decoration. Now let's talk for a few minutes about the preparing of the parchment. It is estimated that in the Middle Ages, some 200 to 300 hides were used in the making of each Bible manuscript. The source of parchment, or vellum, at any given time and place in Europe depended on the population's meat-eating habits with relation to goat, sheep, and calf. Animal skins for making vellum, then, were often the byproduct of the abbey's butcher shop. What's the difference between parchment and vellum? Generally speaking, parchment is sheep or goat skin, and vellum is cow or calf skin. Parchment is thicker and more coarse, and vellum is thinner and of a finer grain. The word parchment comes from the name Pergamum, an ancient city of Asia Minor, where the processing of sheep hides for the purpose of writing was perfected around 200 BC. The word vellum comes from the Latin vellus, meaning a fleece, and that's very synonymous with sheepskin, of course. How were animal skins prepared for bookmaking? In the history of illuminated manuscripts, Christopher de Hanwell provides a good description. Skins were soaked in running water for several days. They were then immersed in a solution of lime and water for up to a fortnight. Then all the hair was scraped off, and the skins were put back into the lime solution for another fortnight. Next, they were rinsed, stretched over the frame, and dried in the sun, and cleaned over and over again with pumice and water. It becomes immediately evident how important a good source of running water for the production of good vellum was. On parchment sheets, the hair and the flesh sides can usually be discerned. The hair side feels slightly more rough or fuzzy. This hair side is a better surface for writing because the ink leaves a darker and clearer image than on the flesh side, which is smoother and often shiny. Before being used, dried and stretched, parchments were sized in a gelatin, often made from boiled bits and pieces of animal skin, and then they were re-dried before being folded and cut for use. What do the hair and the flesh sides look like? It's fairly easy to tell the difference on goat parchment, which is relatively sturdy and coarse. Look closely at the monitor, and perhaps you can just discern the pattern of where the hair once was. And I'm going to ask Andrea to sort of move that around a little bit and see if the camera can come in just as close as it can. Okay, that's as close as it can. You can see little directions, sort of little modeled patterns where the hair was. Now, conversely, on the opposite side of that piece of vellum, it's much whiter. You don't see the mottled sort of yellowish brown effect, and it's also much smoother. You don't see the grain, as it were, of where the hair pattern traveled. The readied parchment was folded to make a choir or a gathering. And for demonstration purposes, I'm going to use an oversized sheet of what would be about elephant folio size paper, which looks something like this. What I've done is divided it off into 8 sections, and I think I'm going to come over here so the camera can pick up the whole sheet. The standard choir or gathering for the medieval scribes to work with were divided into 8 leaves. Now, to get that, we have to do some folding. This would be known as a broadsheet. We fold it once, and we have a folio, which means we have 2 leaves, or 4 pages. We fold it down another time, and now the top edges have to be cut if we're going to get inside. What we have constructed now with 2 folds is a quarto, or something with 4 leaves. We fold it again. Now we have to not only cut the tops, but we have 2 foredges that have to be cut. We have 2 that are still open. And we have created 4 leaves, or the 8 pages. Now this is larger than the 8-leaf manuscript book, and we'll see some examples of that later. We're not talking about a large Bible here, but for illustration purposes, that's the way they would have been folded and then cut before use. Any questions on that? It's fairly simple. When more than one monastic scribe copied text, which was common, each worked on his own choir or choirs. These various gatherings were marked so they could be kept in proper order for later sewing and binding. Let's focus on another example. Next came the ruling of these parchment choirs to make guidelines on the surface of the text. And Andrea has put some ruling before you in one of the manuscript books. This ruling was accomplished with a ruler and a dry metal stylus with a lead point, or a dull knife. Vertical rulings were also marked off to contain block-like columns of text. And you can see here the vertical ruling running down the page, and then the horizontal ruling running out even beyond that margin in one instance. Let's prepare to write now. The instrument used for the writing of text in manuscript books was the goose quill. Here's one. Andrea has another one which she'll pass around and let you experience. You can feel it, you can smell it, just don't eat it. The goose was the widely kept domestic bird, and until the turkey was discovered in America, the goose quill provided the majority of pens. The figure we're putting on the monitor now is a 19th century engraved illustration. We see a kneeling scribe with a quill and an ink pot. As in this depiction, the feathers were removed and the point sharpened with a knife and resharpened as necessary. The effort of constantly cutting, trimming, and recutting worn quills was always a problem, and the search for a more permanent metal pen had gone on since Roman times. Inks were made with specific writing uses in mind. Common carbon ink was made from either lamp black or charcoal, and a gum solution from a vegetable source such as the almond or plum tree. But carbon and gum inks remained largely on the surface of the writing material. Another type of inks which bit into the writing surface and therefore had better staying power were the iron gall inks, made by mixing crushed oak galls, which contain gallic acid and tannin, with an iron salt such as ferrous sulfate. Galls are produced from swellings on trees where wasp eggs are hatched. From these dried galls, tannic acid was soaked out and, when mixed with the iron salts, produced a gray to black ink, a recipe for homemade ink. I've copied that recipe in case you're interested in running home and stirring up a batch. And let me just read from this. To make 3 pints of ink, take galls and gum, 2 ounces of each, and 3 ounces of copperas. Copperas, by the way, is a green iron sulfate used especially in making inks and pigments, and it's sometimes referred to as green vitriol. Crush the galls and soak them 3 days. Then boil them in 3 quarts of rainwater or water from a still pool. When they have boiled enough and the water is almost half boiled away, take it off the fire, add the copperas and gum, and stir it until it is cold. Then put it in a cold, damp place. After 3 weeks, it spoils. Let's take a moment's pause to envision where manuscript books were made. We'll look at the environment. On the monitor is a medieval illustration. It shows the place where these books were prepared and copied. Note the seated scribe in the left forefront. The room was known as the scriptorium, which meant a place of writing. This room often served as the monastic library as well. In fact, in this illustration, several volumes are visible in the cupboard facing the writing table. This, by the way, would have been known as a rather well-stocked medieval library, to have 6 or 8 books. From this illustration, you can also get the idea of the monk scribe seated in a separate cell, which is known as a carrel. This is a concept still familiar in research libraries today, where graduate students and faculty can pursue their research in relative quiet and seclusion in the library carrel. That's assuming you can get one. In another illustration, you see that in each carrel was a desk and reading frame to hold the book being copied. Also, there was an awl, stylus, parchment, and pumice for the scribe to erase his errors, and weights hanging from the desk to to hold the parchment in place. See 3 more tools of the trade: goose quills, a sharpening and scraping knife, and again, an ink pot. What was the work schedule like? 6 hours daily were devoted to writing, equaling all the daylight hours not devoted to liturgical duties. Since burning candles posed a danger of fire, work ceased at sunset. Also, silence was the rule in the scriptorium, hopefully decreasing the chances for additional errors which might be introduced if one's attention was distracted by conversation. Hand signals in this silent environment were used to call for needed supplies, which the person in charge and his helpers would deliver to the scribes as they worked. Yes, question?
My understanding was that they were called carols also because at this time people actually didn't read to themselves. They actually murmured the words as they read, and that actually there was, my understanding was it was a fairly loud place with lots of, people reading out loud because people did not read to themselves.
In terms of reading, you're quite right. It was considered very strange for people to read through the mind and through the eye only. That was looked on with some suspicion. So yes, but it isn't carol in the sense of C-A-R-O-L, caroling, as we think of it. It's C-A-R-R-E-L in this instance, but that is correct. It was assumed that you must speak to read. We're going to now turn to the copying of a manuscript. What did the text block of a medieval manuscript look like? Here's a southern French manuscript dating from about 1300 AD. Following the calendar of the book's contents, which consists of a practical handbook for confessors, we find in an angular red Gothic hand the word incipit, I-N-C-I-P-I-T, meaning here begins, followed by a description of the work to follow. At the end of the text, it was usual for an explicit to be present. This is a word contracted from the Latin explicitus est liber, meaning it is unrolled to the end. The word explicit refers to when books were scrolls, so that in order to get to the end, you would have to unroll it. Obviously, you don't unroll a codex. And that appears, as you've just seen, on the final leaf of that manuscript, 3 lines from the bottom. Manuscripts were supposed to be copied exactly from the texts provided. In actual practice, it was not uncommon for explicits to be augmented with personal statements of the scribe or for marginal editorial comments to be made along the way. How about these? Quote, thin ink, bad vellum, difficult text. Or, thank God, it will soon be dark. Or at one conclusion, now I've written the whole thing. For Christ's sake, give me a drink. If you want to see some more of these, you can check in special collections into Mark Drogan's Anathema, Medieval Scribes, and the History of Book Curses. This is usually a very popular book after I have done this lecture for Dr. Vaughn. After the incipit, which we just talked about, the black or brown ink text was copied. Spaces were left for painted capital letters in red or blue, for gold leaf illumination of initials, or decorations with various pigments. Note in this 15th century French manuscript the prepared space for a decorative capital S to be added for the word salve in the upper left of this particular leaf. Errors made by a scribe were scraped away with a knife or rubbed out with pumice powder. Manuscripts were proofread by a corrector and finally by the abbot, who held ultimate responsibility for the format and content of the manuscript book. Now, let's look a little bit about the decoration and illuminating. This is usually what interests people the most. when they're looking at or talking about manuscript books. After the monk scribes completed the body of the text of a given manuscript, finished the choir or the gathering completely, it fell to others within the monastic community to undertake the decoration and illumination of that manuscript. The medieval artist did not buy inks and paints ready-made, but concocted them from elements in nature. We have already talked about some of the ingredients used in making inks. Now let's focus on the pigments and the materials used to produce some of the more commonly used colors in medieval manuscripts. The ochres. These came from a mixture of iron oxides and earth minerals, and they produced shades of yellow, orange, and red. Vermilion, which is the brightest of reds, resulted when a mixture of mercury and sulfur was heated. And vermilion was one of the most important colors to the process of making medieval illumination, and also for rubricating the text. Other red dyes came from larvae incrustations on trees, from madder root, which is a Eurasian herb, and the tropical Brazil wood. As I've already said, shades of red were very crucial to the manuscript process. Blues were almost as important, as was the red, and those sources included things such as the powdered lapis lazuli and plants like indigo and agurite, which is a copper ore. For greens, typical sources included powdered malachite, earth clays, and plant saps such as iris and parsley leaves. Saffron, of course, for yellow, and also sulfide of arsenic provided another source. And the whites, for whites we have lead, lime, bird eggshell, and the ashes of burned bones. And as the decorated initial D, now before the camera, reminds us, we mustn't forget gold illumination, which gave such brilliance and majesty to medieval manuscripts. Gold came from two sources: paint, made from powdered gold, and gold leaf, the far more brilliant of the two, from foil. Gold leaf was made by hammering gold, usually from a coin, to the thinness of a cobweb. Now on the monitor you see an engraving from Diderot's famous 18th century encyclopedia showing the process of gold beating to produce the thin foil sheets. It takes only a tiny piece of gold to cover something as large as a statue, for instance. It really, by the time the process is finished, has been spread out very, very thin. In the case of manuscript books, both pigments and gold most often were affixed to parchment with the whipped white of an egg. Let's look at how a few of these colors were used in actual manuscripts, which are in our collections here at the University of Houston. A red ochre is visible in a miniature painting from this 13th century English Old Testament and Apocrypha. Note the incredibly small size of the script. And actually on camera it looks much larger than it really is. I'm going to ask the camera to pull back a bit. Okay, right about there. Now, that's about what it would look like if you were looking at it straight on, and that's certainly not legible. There are 48 lines to a page in double columns. Our next example shows a very deep blue, yellow, and gold paint, and they're used in this floriated miniature showing the crucified Christ seated above the world. Floriation refers to the leaves and tendrils surrounding three sides of the painting. This leaf is from the 14th century East Anglian manuscript seen earlier. Also from the same manuscript is another foliated miniature showing St. Jerome at his work translating the Bible. And the Bible here, as you will see, is depicted as a scroll. It's falling back over the table that he's working on. A muted green forms the border, which offers a contrast to the bright red of his garment. But note the difference in the gold paint at the four corners of this miniature, and then we'll slide across the page to see the gold leaf used in the illuminated initial and the floreation in those borders. You see the shine coming off of that as opposed to the gold leaf. Andrea, let's move back about halfway there, if we can just sort of see the two. It's going to be a little hard to do because we can't bend the binding. But the gold leaf has a very dull, flat feel. The gold paint has a very flat, dull finish. Yes, question?
Get the light on that.
Press your...
If you could get the light on that, I think you could get the shine, maybe by tilting it toward you. Or away
There,
from-
that did it. Yeah. Yeah, you can see the light play off the illuminated initial, which does not play off of the gold paint. Thank you. Another excellent example of gold leaf is in the initial D for the word Deus, meaning God, and the rectangular border around the text that Andrea is now turning to, and I'll wait for her to catch up here. We have to handle these very carefully. Okay, in that initial D, if we can come in very tightly till we can see the blue, you can see the white pigment which exists within that blue of the initial D. And then let's move the camera out because I want to bring attention to some of the border on it. We're going to have to come in a little closer than that. And probably a little closer still, but you'll see what I mean in a second. Although this manuscript has suffered an unfortunate later cropping in its rebinding, there's some wonderful characters on this page that are just straight out of medieval times. For instance, in the upper left, we see a winged dragon. Andrea, you want to point to the dragon? You can see his leg, and then his head actually goes up to the very top, and the top of his head is cropped off, and a vine is coming out his mouth. And then in the lower left of the same manuscript page, we see a viol player, and that's very interesting, but what's even more interesting is that the bottom half of his body is the body of a goat. Not only is it a goat, it's a green goat. And then over to the right, we see two cartwheeling monkeys along the lower edge, and in the middle of the monkeys, there's this wonderful little blue dog that's just seated there taking in the whole thing. Can we come in on the little dog a little more? Okay. Well, you'll just have to come up to Special Collections and see the blue dog. What can I say? This manuscript is a 15th century French book of hours, by the way. Now we'll talk a little bit about the binding, which is the final step in the production of the manuscript book. Let's take a look at another illustration. First, the completed quires or gatherings were sewn together. As a protection for early medieval manuscript books, thin wooden boards were used as covers. What happened next? During the Middle Ages, these boards were given a full leather cover across the top, back, and spine, thus giving rise to full binding in the modern sense. Deerskin, sheepskin, and pigskin were used in binding. Calf was introduced in the 15th century, with parchment becoming popular at that time also. The parchment used for binding purposes was of a thicker variety than that used for the contents of a manuscript book. There were utilitarian bindings, those whose function was simply the protection of the contents, and those which had cause to be more showy, such as copies of daily offices placed on a high altar, or books of hours owned by royalty, the nobility, or the wealthy merchant class. For mere protection, wooden, parchment, or leather bindings were sufficient. But in the case of specially commissioned books, precious metals and gems might decorate a binding as well. Let's look at some examples of various types of bindings. And these, Andrea, I think I'll just come over to the truck and pick up. Here is a typical wooden oak board binding with a leather spine. Now, this happens to be not contemporary to the period, but a modern recreation, but it's a very good one, which shows a very typical binding of this period. These are called raised bands, and you often see them on books today. A lot of times they're fake now. But because of the way sewing was done, and I'll show you a good example of that in a moment, leather that covered the spine had to be raised over the bands because the bands we're talking about here is the sewing, the thread that has formed sort of a row of a knot sequence going across here. Those threads looked like this. And you see that if there were leather over here, we'd have to have raised bands to actually cover this book. It was very common at this time to have books come in this form. You would simply purchase this group of gatherings. It might be sewn, or you might have that done. And then, depending upon your means, you would decide how you were going to bind that, if you were going to bind it at all. In this case, a parchment binding sufficed for this book. This is probably sheepskin, and simply folded over, and that was that. Pardon me. We have another example of this book, which is from 1474, up in Special Collections, which has a leather binding. And the final example that I've brought down today is this leather binding, which has nice blind tooling on it, and it also has these metal corners. On the front side, you see one even in the center. Do you know what those were for? Any guesses? It protected it, and it would protect it from falling, but it protected it when it was just sitting. Because in medieval libraries, books were very often shelved like this, with maybe the author or abbreviated title penned along the foredge. If you put something else on top of it, these metal pieces, which act like bumpers on a car, would protect the leather binding. And they're known as bosses. Bosses may be thought of more readily on armor, shields, because a boss design would be the central portion of a shield, which would be, I'm left-handed, so I always tend to do this, would be in front of your most vital parts to shield it. So the bosses on books take the name from the shield. So those are three of the most common bindings from the medieval period. Any questions about those bindings? Well, this is our brief tour through the manuscript books for this session, and what you have experienced here is a wholly natural product. There's nothing synthetic in this process. The paper is vegetable matter. The ink comes from earth or vegetable sources. The binding from animal sources. Pigments, all of these things are natural. So all that we have left to do is for me to invite you to Special Collections. You have the option of an assignment to come up and write an impressionistic paper based on these books. I will say that this has become such a popular assignment, and so many students are coming up to Special Collections to work with the books, that we have the high-class problem of having to mete out one book per student now, just simply to preserve these books. So we are happy to have you come up. We will help you in any way we can with your book, and I think you'll have a wonderful time with it. I don't think that many of your friends have the opportunity of working with 700- or 800-year-old books every day, so you can really be one up on the deal here. And we look forward to seeing you in Special Collections. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pat. That was a wonderful presentation on the medieval book and what it consists of and how it was made. It was very illuminating, to use a pun. How many of you in this class have been to special collections and seen the books there already? Oh, good, lots of you. How about off campus? University Center, the Woodlands, have you been? No, you haven't been? Okay, how about West Houston Institute? Have any of you been? They don't know how to use the microphone anymore. We haven't talked to them in so long. Has anybody off campus used been to special collections? No. Okay. Well, I thought we might have some questions at this point, and I do have a few slides to show you of the actual manuscript, so we might have a couple of questions and then look at those slides. We have a question here.
She talked about the pictures around the script of the manuscripts, and did they have anything to do with the story? I don't understand how a green dog or a what was it? A blue dog or a green-legged goat person has to do with the story.
In the later Middle Ages, when we get past, even earlier, they start decorating with grotesque figures and dragons and little made-up animals that you've never seen before, and they just decorate it, and it has nothing to do with the text. While the illuminated initials and the miniatures in them do have something to do with the story that's being told, but then as time goes by, they do more and more decoration on the outside. Any other questions? It may have occurred to you that that one miniature manuscript she showed that was so tiny that you really couldn't see it. Well, the lens, the magnifying glass, was invented in the Middle Ages, and a lot of these artists painted through a magnifying glass. And then somebody got the bright idea to make two lenses and put them over your eyes, and they invented spectacles, and it's the artists who did that first. Well, maybe we could see a few of those slides right now. We have about 8 minutes left. Maybe Don could show us some of the slides, and I'll talk about them as they come on the screen. I just put in a series of our of the different slides of manuscripts in our library. Okay, there's a full-page manuscript. I believe that's one that she showed us already. I think she showed us that, and you can see there are some little critters there, down there in the corner. Do you want to go to the next one? Okay, this is a close-up, and there you see a kind of alchemist with a it looks like a bottle with some kind of fluid in it, and it makes you think of the kind of inks that they were brewing up, and I'm sure the alchemist did something with those chemical sorts of concoctions. Those of you who are chemists in this class might be very interested in this. Notice on the right, as we're facing the screen, is another dragon, a wonderful little dragon with the alchemist on the left. Okay, the next slide. And there we see two dragons up at the top. I don't know whether they're definitely dragons, aren't they? They look like they're part bird, but they have those sort of lizard tails that turn into vines. Okay, the next one. Okay, and this is, I hope I didn't get these backwards. Looks like another dragon on the right. Okay, the next one. Oh, there we have a dragon on. I was obviously in love with dragons when we took these pictures. There are some dragons on both the left and the right with foliated tails. Okay, the next one. And this looks like the same one we already saw. No, it's got two animals down at the bottom. We've got a hound chasing a deer, and this is a kind of hunting scene, a nature scene. And often in the margins of the manuscripts, you will see scenes from nature. And later there are books written that are called bestiaries that show all kinds of different animals. So they're very interested in the natural world. and they try to recreate it as best they can. Okay, the next one. I'm not sure what this is. It looks like a dragon, and it looks like we cropped it off just to look at the dragon and the vines. Okay, the next one. Oh, this is the same one she showed us with the little viola player and the monkeys and the dog. Okay, the next one. And this is a harp player, and again with blue dogs. That dog, I don't know if he has a bone or a fish in his mouth. There, okay. The next one. Oh, this is a little blue monk whose hood is hiding his face, and he's carrying a bowl. I wonder if he's an alchemist too. But this is a mysterious blue monk that has nothing to do with the text who's shown. Oh, he's got a dog or something foot. Yeah, you're right. He does. They try to construct these sort of odd beasts often in the manuscripts. Okay, the next one. This is an initial S, an illuminated S that we might have seen. Remember that one manuscript she showed us with a space missing. Okay, the next one. There we have a pair of dragons with their necks intertwined. And it kind of reminds you of an interlace kind of design. Okay, the next one. And there we have another deer with another hound, the deer being chased by the hound. Medieval people were very fond of hunting. I guess those trees represent the forest. Okay, the next one. And there is a beast. I think he might be a fox. Do you think he's a fox or a dog? Fox. A fox. He looks like a fox, doesn't he? Okay, the next one. Now, I think I may have gotten this one in backwards. Possibly. It looks... It's upside down and backwards, okay. Well, I think we're going to have to skip that one. Okay, and there we have a snake twined around the border there at the bottom. Okay, the next one. And there's a little bunny, a blue bunny, yeah, on the vine. Okay, the next one. Oh, this is another manuscript that she didn't show us. I just picked a couple of pictures from that. This is a later one. I believe it's 15th century and it's German. And it has very unique borders. I haven't seen any borders like this anywhere else. If you look at this manuscript and go through the borders, it's extremely interesting. It's very highly decorated, and there's a lot of Italian influence there. If you look down there at that blue face at the very bottom, it's very Italianate. But the whole manuscript is not necessarily Italianate. The flower on the left is very naturalistic, although the vine on the right is quite stylized. If we go to the next slide, we'll see another example from that manuscript. And there is another very stylized one. I'm sorry I didn't get any flowered ones. A lot of the borders of this manuscript are floral, and they're very highly naturalistic. They look very real. So you'll have to go to special collections to see that one. Okay, thank you for the slides. That's all of them that I had.
Dr. Vaughn,
Yes, question.
I'm not able to make it downtown during the week. Is special collections open on Saturdays?
No, I'm sorry, it's not. It's never open on Saturday. It is open on Wednesday night, I believe until 7 o'clock, if you could make it then. 8 o'clock? It's open till 8 o'clock. Good.
Will the Museum of Fine Arts have any manuscripts?
No, but there are 2 manuscript leaves at the Menil collection. I don't
Okay,
believe...
I saw those.
You saw those, okay. I think that's about the best we can do for you. I'm really sorry
Okay.
if you can't get to it.
Thank you.
We have 40 seconds. I'm so glad to hear from off campus. We've been waiting to hear from you. Okay, we're going to take a break now, and when we come back, I'm going to walk you through the centuries of manuscript illumination, and we'll take a look at how it developed and how the script developed, and this will lead us to the revival of the schools in Europe, and I'll talk about how the schools developed and how they used these manuscripts. So let's take a 15-minute break, and we'll see you in a few minutes.